conference, bridging our issues of security and justice with the broader issue of global development. And we are lucky to have an esteemed and geographically, thematically diverse panel here. We will be listening to presentations in the order of the listing on your program. We've got Des Gasper from the International Institute of Social Studies, where we are privileged to hold many of our sessions. Likewise, we have Shamika Jayansundara, also from the International Institute of Social Studies. We have David Malone from our United Nations University, Thomas Pogge, Director of the Global Justice Program at Yale University, and Jan Wouters, Director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. And thank you all very much for joining us. And I'm Nanette Svensson from Tulane University. I will now turn this over to our first speaker. I would also ask you all to come to the podium, if that's all right, because we've got that microphone working in good order, as we haven't always been able to count on today. So thank you very much, and we'll get started. Also, just for the audience, we'll have about a 15-minute presentation from each of our panelists, and then we will go for collective question and answers.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a joint paper with Shamika Jayasundara. It's not directly on the SDGs. It's on the relationship between human security thinking and human rights frameworks. And we were assigned in this panel, but we hope that it gives you also some relevant part of context for the post-2015 trajectory in which the relationship between different languages being used in and around the UN system has some significance. Are people pulling in the same direction or not? So we were triggered to write the paper by a recent paper in Human Rights Quarterly by Rhoda Howard-Hussman, I think a colleague of even some of the participants here from Wilfrid Laurier University, and who I had the pleasure to meet earlier this week at the preceding conference. A paper called Human Security Undermining Human Rights, and suggesting the two may be competing discourses, unlike the sort of language which Kofi Annan and others emphatically use, that these are sister faces of the same enterprise. So you might say, well, how far does such a dispute between academics around which language is better matter? Isn't it the case that human security language, which became prominent in the 90s and is recognized as making a number of useful contributions, person-centered view of security, and therefore correspondingly an integrative look, cross-boundary, cross-discipline, etc., look at how people live, including with attention to how people think and feel, etc., with a prevention focus, etc., but didn't get universally accepted. Continuing tensions, we found ways to substitute and work around. We have other terms that do some of the variously perform the functions which human security language was trying to fulfill. Languages like livelihoods, just security, this week, etc. However, the dispute seems to matter because human security analysis hasn't now sort of faded away as workaround terms have been introduced, but it continues to spread. It continues to be used. It appears to fulfill some functions, and it's been adopted as a, at least noted, as a a relevant approach for the UN in the 2012 General Assembly resolution. You don't seem to get a picture, which I have in the PowerPoint, which is a recent handbook of human security, just illustrating this spread and the many lines of work in which we see human security analysis, conflict, crime, environment. There's a UN Institute. There's a chapter in the latest IPCC general assessment, migration, etc. So it's spread, it's hard to keep track of. We're at the handbook stage. And in fact, you don't seem to get a lot. I'm sorry about that. This is just these were some pictures of also work in peace building. Recent reports from various sources talking about human security framework. One from GPAC, which is Global Alliance for Peace Building here in The Hague. And there were others here, the Handbook on Climate Change and Human Security from a couple of years back. Similar big volumes, Migration and Human Security. But hopefully in a while I'll come to text and then that'll be readable. So this was just a panoply of book covers, though. Lots of work on gender, women's well-being, violence against women, etc. Lots of work on the paradox of the inconsistency between so-called subjective indicators of security and so-called objective indicators of security. And the example there was the Benin Human Development Report of about 3 years ago, which showed systematically such discrepancies in Benin, and then built as a counterpart to the Human Development Index for the area districts of Benin. It built a subjective human security index, and these two are dramatically different, district by district. Okay, this has survived. So it seems to be that there are some widespread functions, roles, which human security framework is found to help us fulfill. And the formulation which the Human Security Unit in the UN uses, in fact, seems to capture what is being done here. There's the people focus, which then leads into context-specific, cross-boundary type investigation, situationally flexible, with attention to not just protection, but prevention and empowerment, and often giving interesting, quite surprising results, as opposed to what more generalized or discipline-based frameworks give us. So some value added. One could say, seems obvious, that human rights ideas and human security ideas are complementary. Human rights ideas also need some case-by-case prioritization. There's a concern with stability, and rights are a format for entrenching basic priorities. So both types of language seem inevitable and important partners. Professor Howard Husband raises a number of worries, and her languages, human security approaches, in practice often undermine the international human rights regime. She acknowledges, but without emphasis, hence it's not in bold there, that human security approaches, in fact, have helped in identifying new threats to human rights, new groups whose human rights are at risk, new duties, new instruments. So she refers in passing to issues of economic instability, of climate change, situation of non-citizens, migration issues, and instruments such as International Criminal Court, etc. So within the human rights framework, she sees additions that have been brought in through human security thinking. But her emphasis in discussion is, well, but this is at best a sort of subsidiary supportive framework, and in fact it brings risks. It confusingly repeats in the new terminology what is already well covered in the human rights regime. It's too loose on priorities because rights are rights, but human security she sees as then a language for getting around rights. Yeah, it's an alternative. And it's too broad. It covers too much. It takes us beyond what law and public policy can address. I refer you to the paper for the full picture. And in our paper, we try to look at, in a number of case sectors, drawing on available literature, also our own previous research, to look at the relationships, competition, complementarity between human rights perspectives and human security perspectives. And we follow the spirit, and in some cases the substance, of authors such as Edwards and Firstman in their book Human Security and Non-Citizens, and also very interesting recent work by Dorothy Estrada Tunk. This is work in progress, but here are the cases, and we will refer to briefly to 3 of those. So, violence against women is a much discussed territory, and it's well covered by Estrada Tunk, amongst others. So, she looks at cases in a number of jurisdictions, including from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and tries to draw out how human security perspectives have helped to give us a more adequate, wider-ranging analysis of the causes of rights violations, looking at structures, economic, cultural, which make women vulnerable, and also looking at issues of state response or state non-response, state indifference, state negligence, and then leading to an agenda of proposed response by the Inter-American Court, demanding due diligence in respect to action on not merely compensation for demonstrated harm, but prevention. So this is presented as an area of evident complementarity where human security perspectives have helped to enrich the analysis undertaken and the recommendations arising through human rights processes. Second area, climate change, where there are obvious arguments for the relevance of human rights as trying to focus attention on harm and duties, as having a global scope for corresponding to a global issue, and as not being trapped within the nation-specific framework which limits and, in fact, stymies a great deal of climate change discussion. However, the legal format for human rights has many limitations for climate change. The question of who can have access to the legal system, how a legal system could ever deal with issues on this scale, and the questions of attribution. So that it's very plausibly arguable that a human security framing leading into an insurance format for appropriate response is more helpful, more feasible for looking at climate change damage. In addition, apart from that, it's arguable that the perspective in human security analysis on open global systems, thus on interconnectedness and associated human vulnerabilities, is appropriate. And so both a analytical contribution and a perspectival contribution are arguable. Our third case, those are rather standard cases in current discussion. Our third case is less standard, and Shamika will say something about lessons from the trajectory in the past decades in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, thank you. This is not a very easy case to present in 3 minutes. It was actually
No,
my...
you guys, take your
more
time.
than
You're
time?
two.
Okay.
I didn't realize you were presenting.
Okay. In any case, it's still not easy. Because to understand Sri Lanka, at least for me as a Sri Lankan, it takes about 2,500 years of revisiting of the history to understand what it is going on there now. But nevertheless, I'll try to summarize as small as possible. So this Howard Husman's paper raised several questions, and I was constantly grappling with particularly the human rights, the way it was enforced in Sri Lanka and it was practiced in Sri Lanka, and particularly I would say it has a dirty name in Sri Lanka, human rights. And why and so? Because I think human rights has the enforcement capacity and it should be upheld, particularly in relation to the ethno-political conflict. But in Sri Lanka, it became part of the conflict, and we are kind of at a stage that the debate is frozen in the human rights, and it is very competing. Everybody uses instrumentally human rights frameworks to advance their arguments, but nothing happens on the ground. The people's rights are being violated, and particularly when it comes to the Tamil minority group, and nothing is happening. So it's always interesting to see how we can search a way out of this now, because the damage has already happened. So, but we still need to go forward. So, what we thought is that there are limitations of human rights regime when it is acting alone. At least in this specific case, it was very obvious. Its right-based approach is good, it should be there, but can it stand alone? Can it deliver alone? That is one of the food for thought. And also, it raises questions about under what conditions, dynamic structures and processes in the environment, in the immediate as well as in the wider environment, that allows human rights to act alone or human security to act alone or together. Or what nature of partnership that we should seek in terms of protecting the rights of people and guaranteeing the securities of people. And I think this latter idea is very much, these questions were raised when you look at it from a very broader perspective. I think that is where the strength of human security comes into play, because it looks at issues very broadly, not only the violation of rights in the immediate, vicinity. And also the case of Sri Lanka kind of illuminated the need to pay attention to structural vulnerabilities, because we had to look at the case of Sri Lanka through a series of historical perspectives. and the intersects of different trajectories of development of the state and so. So without having that knowledge, without looking that broader and understanding the underlying vulnerabilities which are rooted structurally and I would say even culturally, it is impossible to find a solution or impossible just the human rights agenda to make any impact. And also the critical and pervasive threats that the human security framework talks about that needs to be both brought into attention. And a little bit of a history, because Sri Lanka is very well regarded as a, darling of democracy in the 60s, 70s, it's the model democracy of the former British colony. But things went down pretty fast after, a couple of decades. And particularly back then, we didn't have the right in language of human rights so strong, but we had the language, in a way, at least a notion of human security, very, very much encapsulated in the idea of social democracy and welfare state model, which came to be the guarantor. It served as a better guarantor of the social and economic rights in particular. But with 1977, the liberalization of the economy, it progressively dismantled these guarantees of rights, particularly in the social and economic domain. And I would say that it is obvious, on one hand, Sri Lanka was inducted and indoctrinated to the liberal international order by becoming one of the first South Asian countries to become a liberal state model. But at the same time, we had to sign up a lot of agreements, human rights agreements, to become part of that system. But at the same time, the very system, particularly at the economic front, it to be realized, you had to at the same time not respect the rights. So there is a contradiction in the system itself. On one hand, it demands you to, embrace all this. On the other hand, it's a more or less a kind of complicity of the international community. So this needs to be understood, because you cannot just look at even the ethnic conflict or the development in Sri Lanka without looking at how these different, waves and, different forces kind of intersected. And also, that is the time period in which the freedom from want and freedom from fear of all the ethnic communities, particularly the young generations from the both Sinhali and the Tamil groups, came to be exploded and manifested in a brutal ethno-political conflict as well as a civil war. And what did the state do, who has signed all these human rights agreements and everything? Yeah, they went back to the old state paradigm where the national security was upheld. And because the nature of the threat to the state from the liberation tigers of Tamil Elam is asking for a separate state. So state came to the defense of the national territorial integrity at the cost of violation of rights. But it was all allowed. There were noises made, but it all happened, I would say, broad daylight. It's like a robbery in the broad daylight when it comes to human rights situation. And also, later in the 90s and in the 2000s, the very same project of liberal state project came with as a solution the neoliberal peace paradigm to be applied to Sri Lanka as a way out of the conflict. But in that project, human rights was again flashed very strongly. But the situation, the general environment, the structural vulnerability is particularly rooted now in the economic system. And what you have to do to open your markets, to have free trade, all that consistently undermined it. So it is, in Sri Lanka, it was a lack of Kantian moral philosophy which is originally encapsulated in the liberal peace idea. It was imposed, it was from outside, it never realized locally. There's no indigenous ownership, there was no legitimacy to it. So it came the people met it with a lot of resistance. So, what does this say about some of the Hassman's claims? Hassman claims, on average, signing and ratifying international human rights treaties contribute to improved human rights records of a country. But we could see, at least in the case of Sri Lanka, we investigated thoroughly, which is not the case. It's rather the opposite. Even to date, you can see it's in the bottom of any indicator when it comes to human rights. And also, Hassman says, implicitly, Asian developmental regimes prefer going along with broader human security over human rights to bypass or smooth pedal on human rights obligation to its citizens. But if you look at the case of Sri Lanka, is it the Asian developmental regimes or is it the liberal state building project itself, which is globally, pushed through to the country? Of course, the elites accepted it because, of course, there are instrumental uses for that. Is it the liberal state building or neoliberal peace building project that itself undermined the international human rights regime? For me, it looks like, shooting on your foot. So that is something that we observed. And also, there are points that Hassman says. There's a possibility of solo application of human rights, but at least in this case, it is important, I would say, to bring back the human security lens to understanding all the framing of the problems, because there is no other way out. And also, it should not be part of the parochial neoliberal project of peace building or state building. It should be rather an emancipatory political project where all these threats, the vulnerabilities that we will look at very broadly and see how we can benefit from that interpretative power and the normative power, the moral power embedded in the human security language to become a better aid for human rights to be realized in Sri Lanka.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I've got 1 minute just to give some
Please.
conclusions. Yeah. Firstly, we suggest, though the project is underway, this is our thinking at the moment, that within human security thinking, there's not just a sort of watered-down version of a values agenda, a deontology, but there's an analytic perspective, you can call it an ontology of people as living in social, economic, environmental systems. And what Howard Hassman attacks as the broader view of human security, which is problematic, is in fact this analytic, explanatory perspective, which then in fact is the basis of the contributions that she acknowledges have been made through human security analysis to identifying new threats, identifying neglected groups, new duties, new instruments, etc. So, identification has happened on an important scale and is a result of the broad scope of human security analysis, which she otherwise problematizes, and our suggestion is, yes, the approaches are complementary. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Des and Shamika, for that presentation on human security versus or alongside human rights with the illustrative case of Sri Lanka. We'll now hear from David Malone, please.
Thank you. Well, I should go up there. That's right.
You can have the mic.
Okay, good. I'd prefer that, actually. Thank you. Podium's a bit daunting. So thank you very much. That was extremely interesting on Sri Lanka in particular. I'm going to speak mainly about development itself, the SDGs, and one or two other things, I hope quite briefly. I was able to spend about 4 years working on development in a well-funded project that aimed to target the critical ideas that had driven international development programming since about 1950, and how these ideas and experience on the ground of trying to apply them to development efforts created feedback loops, new sets of ideas, new experiences, further new sets of ideas. I was fortunate to work with Rohinton Medora, Ravi Kanbur, and our lead editor, Bruce Curry-Alder, in what turned into a rather massive book. The clear majority of our authors were from the developing world, which was our objective. It's their story. On gender, we did less well, and we blame ourselves. About a third of the authors were women. And the book is available, or the subject matter of the book is available free of charge, as our editing house generously allowed this, on a website called Development Ideas, so www.developmentideas.info. So that's just why I was thinking about development, having worked on development programming 30 years earlier in my life and on developing development funding more recently. What might we relate in the actual world of development to the SDG exercise? I'd say first, the idea from the Rio Summit, the Rio +20 Summit, that really development goals today should apply to all countries. I think that's actually very sensible, because most so-called developed countries have significant, if often fairly identifiable, deficits. For example, in my country, Canada, our Aboriginal communities have been major losers in our own development track, and the country should be much more focused than it is on them. So this idea that the SDGs should apply to all, in principle, is a good one. Whether, in fact, it is accepted in any of the developed capitals, I wonder, because the few developed governments, developed country governments I've spoken to on the subject said, oh, we agreed to that, but we have no intention of, being held accountable on any of this stuff. The second change is that development has actually been occurring in the developing world for the past 15 years. Very strongly in terms of economic growth in Asia, much more strongly than we think on economic growth in Africa, although inequality has grown in both continents. And finally, in terms of social development in Latin America, very impressive 15 years. The trouble has been in the industrialized world, actually, over the last 7 years. And that challenges all of our preconceptions. The developing world has been doing quite a bit better, and we have not in the West. And there's very little reflection of any of this in the alternative reality of the UN. Within the UN bubble, nothing that goes on within the real world tends to be registered when it comes to discussions on development. So the actual change I find very exciting when it comes to the developing world, but as I say, there's very little trace of it at the UN. Third insight, and it came from the high-level panel that Sam Dawes discussed briefly this morning, led by Cameron, the then president of Indonesia, and the still president of Liberia. which produced a very strong analytical essay. The first 40 pages are really very interesting. The best analytical piece I've seen on development in quite a long time, to which they appended a set of possible goals and targets and so on. And the lesson I took from that analysis is that enough development has now actually occurred that the focus is shifting from quantities of things to the quality of, say, service. Let me give you an example. Education. If you look back to the MDGs, the goal was universal primary education, which was a good one, easy to understand. Most countries hadn't come close to achieving it in the developing world, and it focused attention on a real problem. And significant progress has been made over the last 15 years. But actually, what most developing countries are worrying about now is the quality of what kids are being taught in school and teenagers. That's a really urgent problem because having bums on seats doesn't guarantee anything, doesn't guarantee employability, doesn't guarantee much at all. So again, we see progress actually reflected in a bit of the SDGs, because if you look at the draft SDG on education, it has two concepts: high quality education, and the second, which is aspirational but sensible, is lifelong learning. Why lifelong learning? Lifelong careers are less and less likely for any of our children or grandchildren, so lifelong learning becomes much more important than it was for old codgers like me. So there we see a degree of change which does in effect track somewhat the reality of development occurring. Now, where do the SDGs get developed? They get developed within the UN. The UN isn't a happy place nowadays, partly because it's aging and crotchety, like many aging individuals. The reality isn't cooperating necessarily with the UN schema of things, of ambassadors mattering, of endless resolutions being obeyed, of other ways of functioning within the UN. But the principal problem actually is a pervasive lack of trust. Lack of trust amongst member states, lack of trust between member states, secretariats and agencies, and a general sense of unhappiness arising from that. And that general sense of unhappiness has been reflected very strongly in the process of development of the SDGs. For example, the high-level panel's work, as I say, the analytical part of it, was comprehensively ignored by the open working group set up by member states. Irrelevant. Who are these nobodies? They're just heads of state, and we are the sovereign states of the world represented by first secretaries and occasionally ambassadors. So again, a very alternative reality which explains the rather surreal outcome, which was not at all analytical, it was accretive. It was a process in which a couple of very individually admirable chairs tried to marshal a process towards a sensible outcome, but wound up with 17 goals. Can any government handle 17 goals? I wonder. But 169 targets, I'm quite certain no government can handle, no matter what its level of development. And when you add that they're all compulsory, you're in a different universe altogether. So that's the package we have, and now we have some work going on indicators. in the Statistical Commission of the UN, supported by a number of national statistical agencies and regional ones, should be a rational process, but alas, is becoming politicized. So even the work on indicators is in some difficulty today. So this isn't to say that having SDGs is a bad idea. I think the outcome is very suboptimal, to be polite. Now, mine is a minority view within the UN. Most of my colleagues seem to think it's a fabulous outcome. They are welcome to. I stick to my view. Now, a couple more points on the subject matter of the panel, which I tried to give a bit of thought to, and on which I thought your work provides a number of interesting reflections. First of all, it's clear that considerations of social justice matter more in some parts of the developing world than in others in terms of priorities that societies set for themselves. By the way, one of the conclusions of the book is that we tend to think of polities and economies. We forget that societies are extremely important and that societal preferences often actually determine outcomes, much more than economic priorities or polities do. So, for example, in Asia, economic growth is valued very much. It doesn't mean that social justice isn't. It just means that in Southeast Asia, for example, the focus has been very much on economic growth, and without too much dissent from that focus. In Africa, it's probably more of a balance. And in Latin America, I think the attachment to social justice, to social programming, and so on, is quite a bit stronger, and people are less fussed, perhaps, about economic growth. So again, perhaps universal formulas for development are more helpful as perhaps intellectual frameworks than applicable to every country in the same way. And for the very poor within developing countries, and again, it was very interesting listening to you, my observation in India was that the priority was often more food on the table, which required more income. Of course, people were very upset by the absence of social justice, but the immediate priority was a bit more cash. So for the very poor, social justice is an ideal. It's something they want their children to have. It's something not all of them expect to have themselves in their own lifetimes. And anyway, they're very busy trying to put some more food on the table. With greater development comes a more highly educated public, and that more highly educated public tends to worry much more operationally about issues like corruption. We see that in China, that it's actually the process of development in China that has brought to the fore significant worries about corruption, in my analysis. And when I think about corruption, in conclusion, I like to remind myself that my own country, Canada, was prodigiously corrupt in its period of highest growth, which was in the late 19th century, and that's what we have in common with China and India today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to take the podium? We have Thomas Pogge, who will be speaking from the podium. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I've got a watch.
But a PowerPoint, no.
Not a PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm also a bit among the skeptics about the SDGs, and I want to tell you why. That comes mainly out of the ways in which the SDGs are continuous with the MDGs, and so we can, I think, learn a good bit by looking back on the MDGs, on the Millennium Development Goals. I think both development goal exercises are essentially propaganda exercises. They are meant to show, on the part of politicians, on the one hand that we care, and on the other hand that things are getting better. So in what ways are they nonetheless defective? So in one way that they're defective is that both goal exercises don't really assign clear responsibilities to competent agents. That's sorely missing. You have, of course, goals or targets specified, but these goals don't say who is to do what in order to make it happen. So just to take a random example, right? The MDGs said that we will reduce infant mortality, under 5 mortality by 2/3, but they don't specify who is supposed to do what to make that happen. So everybody can easily agree and say, yeah, that's great, sure, of course, we reduce that by 2/3. But if it doesn't happen, and of course it doesn't happen, we haven't achieved this goal, it's completely unclear who has failed. And so what, given the dominance of Western media, actually happened is, of course, that we all made it appear as though this is a goal that everybody should achieve within their boundaries. So if every country achieves a reduction in under 5 mortality by 2/3, then the world has achieved it. But that is fundamentally unfair because the poorest countries with the highest infant mortality rates are the ones that are given the largest tasks. So Cameroon is supposed to get it down from a very high level to 2/3 below that, and Germany, Canada, and so on and so forth are supposed to reduce their minuscule rates by 2/3, right? That obviously would be an unfair assignment, but given that there is no other assignment specified, that is essentially what many people thought the assignment of responsibilities is, and that's how countries are treated in the press. You say, well, Cameroon hasn't achieved the MDG, and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the monitoring and tracking, which frankly has been a disaster, right? I know this is something tedious to pay attention to, but if we don't pay attention to it, we really are doing an enormous disservice to the poor, if not a betrayal. I could talk at length about extreme poverty, where we had again and again revisions in the way it was defined, right? You all remember that the initial formulation was we will halve the number of extremely poor people, or rather the proportion of extremely poor people, defined as people living below $1 a day. Later it was $1.08 a day, then it was $1.25 a day. Did they raise the poverty line? No, they did not. They lowered it because the dollar a day was $1985, the $1.08 was $1993, and the $1.25 was $2005. Now, if you just look at the inflation rate in the United States, you will see that $1 in 1985 currency is actually $1.82 in 2005 currency. So it was substantially reduced, and of course the result was a much more good-looking poverty trend than would have resulted if we had stuck to the original promise with $1 a day in 1985 currency. But much more scandalous still is the situation with regard to chronic undernourishment. So let me quickly run you through the major steps, right? In 1996, we had the World Food Summit in Rome, and 186 governments unanimously agreed that they were going to halve the number of chronically undernourished people by 2015. The number at that time stood officially at 788 million, so 394 was the target. Now, ever since that time, chronic undernourishment has gone up. The number of chronically undernourished people rose and rose and rose. And that was already clear in the year 2000 when the same governments came together for the Millennium Declaration in New York. And so they changed the goalposts. They said, yeah, we are going to halve chronic undernourishment, but now we define it as the proportion of people who are undernourished in the world. So defining it as a proportion, that's, a ratio, and so you can halve a ratio by halving the numerator or doubling the denominator. And in this case, the denominator is nicely growing because of population growth. So you are reducing the ambition. Now, when they saw that, the officials who were supposed to write up the MDGs, they said, but actually we can do much better than that. And contrary to the officially adopted text of the Millennium Declaration, they defined the Millennium Development Goal number 1 differently in 2 ways. They said, no, we define it as a proportion of the undernourished in the population of the developing countries, which of course is faster growing. And secondly, we backdate the baseline to 1990 so as to lengthen the time period in which population can grow, and so to have more work done in the denominator, less work needs to be done in the numerator. So by the way, all the goals, all the MDGs, were redefined after the Millennium Declaration was officially passed by the UN General Assembly from a baseline of 2000 to a baseline of 1999. One further advantage, not so obvious, of doing that is that all the success that the good Chinese had achieved in the 1990s could this way be counted. And so you have this wonderful thing, the first report that good old Kofi Annan wrote in 2001, where he said, how are we doing with regard to the MDGs? He could report that in the world's most populous region, East Asia and the Pacific, extreme poverty had been halved already in 1999, 1 year before the goal was even announced. All right, so with all these tricks, we still looked very bad with regard to hunger, because as I told you, the hunger numbers had gone up and up, right? And so even you don't get a 50% reduction in the proportion if the hunger numbers keep going up. So, and this was also embarrassing to the World Bank, because the World Bank was constantly reporting that extreme hunger was going down, down, down. And so how can hunger go up, 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 and extreme poverty go down, down, down? Anyway, there was a solution to this problem, and the solution was to change the methodology. What else? So in the year 2012, in the State of Food Insecurity report published each year by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, a new methodology was unveiled in the 22nd year of a 25-year tracking exercise. And the new methodology showed that chronic undernutrition had fallen each and every year since back in 1990. In 1990, it was now, according to the new methodology, over 1 billion, which according to the old methodology, as you all remember, the billion mark was crossed in 2009, right? It was a big thing where they, at FAO headquarters, they had big posters saying we are mad as hell, for the first time in human history, more than 1 billion people undernourished. Never happened according to the latest methodology. So now it crossed above 1 billion already in 1990 and went down steadily ever since. And it went down, and this is the good news that you should remember, it went down despite the doubling of world food prices, which, as you know, doubled twice, basically sort of from 2005 to 2008, and then there was another peak in 2011. And we had riots in the streets and so on and so forth. But the good news is poor people never noticed the doubling of food prices, and hunger and undernutrition continued to go down throughout that period. It was 868 million in 2010, and the latest number just came out, the new SOFI report just came out, it's 795 million. So now, with the latest report, we are almost on track. We're not quite on track, but if we work hard this year, then by the 31st of December, maybe we can get to the halving of chronic undernourishment. So that's a pretty dreadful exercise, and of course, we all are not paying attention. Most of us are not paying attention. The media are not paying attention. Even I can't get the media to pay attention. Even if you tell them, they don't pay attention. And poor people can't resist this, right? What are they going to do? How are they going to get their voices heard? So it's a phenomenal betrayal of the poor, I think, and it's terrible that the United Nations is participating in such an exercise. Let me just say one more thing. SOFI 2012, go to page 50, the small print, and look at the definition of chronic undernourishment. Read that definition carefully. It has 3 elements. You have to fulfill 3 conditions to count as undernourished. The first one is you have to be short of energy. If you are short of anything else, you do not count. Vitamins, doesn't matter. Minerals, proteins, none of that matters. Energy. So the whole undernutrition problem can be solved by Coca-Cola with sugary soft drinks. Secondly, you have to fall short of the minimum requirements of a sedentary lifestyle. If you're not below that 1800 for an adult level, you're not undernourished. If you're a rickshaw driver and you need 4,000 calories, that's your problem, not ours. And thirdly, you have to be below that sedentary lifestyle limit for over a year. So seasonal malnutrition where people hunger through the whole winter or something, sorry, again, you're not part of the undernourished. So that's the second point. The third point is, which again is continuous, is that I think the entire exercise focuses our attention far too much on diachronic comparisons. So we're looking at the world as it is, at the level of deprivation as it is, and we are supposed to compare it with some earlier level, 1990 or 1960 or 1830 or whatever it is. And of course we are supposed to conclude things are getting better all the time. Now, what should we be, from a moral point of view, comparing the status quo to the level of deprivation as it is? Not to the past. We should compare it to what it could be right now. So think of slavery, right? If somebody said in 1840, what are you so worried about slavery for, right? Don't you know it's gotten a lot better? It's a lot better than it was in 1815. Fewer families ripped apart, fewer rapes, fewer whippings, and so on. Even the slaves worked less hard than before, and so on. Okay, so we are supposed to conclude that slavery is all right simply by the fact that it was even worse at an earlier period. Now, that it was even worse at an earlier period is frankly irrelevant to the legitimacy of slavery in 1840. And so I'm saying the same is true with regard to the legitimacy of poverty. It's irrelevant how much worse it may have been in an earlier period. If it's now avoidable, it should now be avoided, full stop. And of course, we all know that it can be avoided. Let's take one statistic which happens to coincide with the turnover from the MDGs to the SDGs, right? One statistic is we just read from Oxfam that in the next few months, for the first time in human history, more than half of all human wealth will be owned by the top 1%. So that already goes to show, right, that there's enough wealth in the world to wipe out poverty several times over. The poorer half of humanity has about 4% of global household income, and if they had 6%, all these deprivations would be gone. But as we just heard, inequality is increasing, and so we are avoidably keeping a very, very large number of people, probably more than half of all human beings, in deprivation to such an extent that their human rights are not fulfilled. So let me make a last point about inequality. Inequality is in the SDGs, and that's a great thing. It's in there as goal number 10, and the signature target is target number 10.1. So what does target number 10.1 demand? It's a little convoluted. You have to read it 2 or 3 times to understand it. But once you understand it, it's actually quite amusing. So what it demands is that by 2030, inequality should have begun to have been reduced. So it can go up indefinitely until 2029, and it should have peaked before 2030 and then have gone into a downward trend. So that's the goal. And that, of course, is far too unambitious, right? What we want is, at the very least, that inequality in the world is less in 2030 than what it is now. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, my thanks for the invitation and my appreciation for being here. It's always great to be at Akens. It feels like coming home, seeing so many friends back. And the theme of this panel, this last plenary panel, couldn't be more topical, I think. It brings together the great global debate of 2015 with the whole theme of justice that makes this city of The Hague so unique in the world. So I propose to share a couple of observations with you from a lawyer's perspective, so a very modest perspective. I'm skeptical as well about the SDGs, but I'm going to try to at least do an effort of positive thinking and shedding a hopeful perspective. My starting point is the following. It's a beautiful quote from the Rio+20 outcome document, The Future We Want. And it says the following: "We recognize that people are at the center of sustainable development, and in this regard we strive for a world that is just, equitable, and inclusive. And we commit to work together to promote sustained and inclusive economic growth, social development, and environmental protection, and thereby to benefit all." All the core concepts of this panel, justice and equity, are clearly linked here to the notion of sustainable development and the post-2015 process. Now, that's Rio+20. And then there's a big gap and a big contrast when you read the current version of the draft Sustainable Development Goals, nicknamed the 169 Commandments by The Economist. And then if you read that, especially when you are a bit like, a human rights lawyer or somebody deeply committed to human rights, you feel like, and I'm going to use a very improper expression, you feel like a cow watching a train. What do I mean with that? Well, I just took the train, and in the Netherlands you can see many cows there, but I feel that, you feel like fulfilled with horror and incomprehension. You see this thing. Why? What do I mean to say? Let me put it a little bit more respectfully. And I go back to a panel which we had at the annual conference of the American Society of International Law in April, where we had the discussion about the SDGs, and where a number of human rights experts basically criticized the SDGs because there are no specific mentions of human rights in the current text of the SDGs. And that's very correct. So somebody, for instance, took issue with the fact that sub-goal 8.7 speaks about the elimination of the worst forms of child labor and of child soldiers, and that the SDGs did not mention more, say, comprehensively the issue of children's rights. But what I think some human rights lawyers tend to overlook is that the SDGs were not intended to be a human rights document. And they deliberately also do not want to be one. And I think that also there the process comes again up. Much unlike the MDGs, the SDGs have been drafted, negotiated through a very cumbersome, painstaking intergovernmental process. And there, of course, all the best and the worst of the UN, the international community's negotiation techniques come to the fore. And in order to be consensusfähig, the SDGs could not have too much of an explicit human rights language. And that is why I think you have to read very carefully through the often woolly language of the SDGs in order to grasp their human rights potential. Because I think if you read it positively, there is a potential if you read them in the right perspective. And I'm going to try to do that a little bit. I'm going to do a little exercise with you in that sense, and I'm still a lawyer. I apologize for my tendency to be exegetic. I'm going to see what is there in the SDGs with regard to global justice and global equity. In fact, start with justice. It's very disappointing. There are only 2 references to justice in the current SDGs. They're in Goal 16. Goal 16 is actually very interesting. It stipulates that they will promote, I quote, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Beautiful phrase, eh? You could have a whole course devoted to this phrase alone. Of course, the big problem is nobody is being held accountable. There is not the detail of saying who is accountable for doing what and so on. But the goal is there. And then there's the sub-goal target 16.3, which reads, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. Now, this may be fairly limited references to justice. But still, it's not too bad. Can a society, when you read this goal, can a society be peaceful and inclusive, as it says, if it is not just? That's simply not possible in my view. And if we realize sub-goal targets 16.3 and we achieve the rule of law both at national and international levels, will we not have made significant strides towards more global justice? Indeed, and there I come to a completely different document, the United Nations General Assembly High-Level Declaration, September 2012, on the rule of law at national and international levels. Very interesting document. Explicitly recognized that the rule of law, and I quote, "The rule of law is the foundation of friendly and equitable relations between states and the basis on which just and fair societies are built." My submission would be, and the basis for that view is again the Rio +20 outcome document, my submission is that we should actually read Goal 16 and Target 16.3 in full consistency with this high-level declaration of the General Assembly. And such a reading opens quite some perspectives for a more holistic approach that is needed to create truly and sustainably peaceful and inclusive societies. Few examples. First of all, such a reading, in light with that high-level declaration, in my view, creates a useful passerelle to peace building. Peace building, which in general is not really the subject matter of, or at least it's not the focus of the current SDGs, but as emphasized in the high-level declaration of the General Assembly, the rule of law is one of the key elements of conflict prevention, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and peace building. And justice, including transitional justice, is a fundamental building block of sustainable peace in countries in conflict and post-conflict situations. Now, the SDGs are not written specifically, and that's another criticism, that there is absence in the SDGs regarding the situation of fragile and conflict or post-conflict states. But again, there, you have to go beyond the current text of the SDGs, and you have to read them together with the Rio +20 document, which rightly specifies that countries in situations of conflict need special attention. And that's, I think, why the contribution, especially of transitional justice mechanisms, for reaching a just and sustainable peace should be stressed. And there's a whole nice passage of the high-level declaration on this importance of transitional justice, saying that there is a need for a comprehensive approach to transitional justice, which incorporates the full range of both judicial and non-judicial measures to ensure accountability, serve justice, provide remedies to victims, promote healing and reconciliation, often neglected, and establish independent oversight of the security system, and restore confidence in the institutions of the state. That's one example. There's another example you can make regarding this need to ensure, the stated objective of ensuring equal access to justice for all. If you read that carefully, ensuring equal access for justice to all, and know that unlike the MDGs, the SDGs are meant indeed to apply both to developed and developing countries, to everybody, then this is a very ambitious objective. To stay within the situation of fragile or post or conflict states, it's very crucial there that there is a broad and inclusive understanding of the notion of access to justice for all, including youth groups, ethnic groups, women as the most commonly disenfranchised groups in post-conflict proceedings, but also for non-conflicted states. Equal access to justice is an incredible challenge, especially in postmodern societies where you have so many divisions within the society. Think also of the problematic of illegal migrants and so on. It's extremely topical for us as well. Now, that's justice. Let me also say a few words about equity, because that's the name of this panel. I'm not sure who defined the titles of the panels, but there is both global justice and global equity in the title of this panel. And interestingly, there are far more references to equity in the current SDGs than there are to justice. But they are very much dispersed. And they're very specific, overly specific sometimes. Quick overview. There's the goal 4, which sets forward to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities. Target 4.1 states that by 2030, we have to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. Wow. Goal 2. Goal 2 is about ending hunger, achieving food security, improving nutrition. In the sub-goals of Goal 2, you find references to equity as well. The idea of ensuring access by 2020 to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Here you find, besides something interesting, complete overlap. There's another sub-goal, another target, which says more or less exactly the same. So one could at least come back to 168 commandments instead of 169. And there are plenty of other references to equity in the goals and in the sub-goals. Very interesting and very diverse. For instance, one of the last sub-goals in this kind of, it's a bit of a lumber room of the SDGs, Goal 17, which brings together everything which the previous goals were not able to capture. So it has this target 17.10, which, and I quote, aims to promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory and equitable multilateral trading system under the WTO, including through the conclusion of negotiations within the Doha Development Agenda. Now, if you follow a little bit the Doha Development Agenda, this sounds like, just a bad copy-paste from one of the previous declarations that I think have, from year to year been issued, and then so I mean, this does not, but it's interesting that there too, the multilateral trading system is mentioned as part of the SDGs. Now, I come to the end of my my reflections on this, but what I think there too, with regard to equity, we are in need of transcending, I think, the specifics of the text and all the, say, very dispersed references to equity, and have a more comprehensive and holistic reading. And there again, you can go back to the Rio Plus 20 outcome document, which, as I said in the beginning of my talk, basically says we have to strive to a world that is just, equitable, and inclusive. And interestingly, even though the specific formulations of the SDGs to equity, even though they are very specific, you can still see that they, maybe unconsciously, link equity to a number of other features of what I think could be sustainable development with people at its heart. It refers to things such as adequacy, affordability, fairness, inclusiveness, non-discrimination. And so, in that sense, how could these things be realized without ensuring equality? And as a high-level panel, which David already referred to, the other high-level panel, observed very rightly, remedying those fundamental inequalities and injustices is a matter of respect for people's universal rights. So with some goodwill, I think you can do a lot of linking of the SDGs to human rights. Ideally, that's my final thought, these overarching goals should be restated. And I've been told they've been working hard to produce some kind of chapeau text for the SDGs. I'm not sure where we stand, whether even there's all kinds of new woolly language entering the scene, but I hope it will be a consistent and readable text, and not something littered with all kinds of non-committal language which pleases everybody and doesn't in the end say anything new, because it can be interpreted in the most progressive and the most regressive ways. So I really hope we will end up with a beautiful declaration in that sense in September of this year. Thank you.
Thank you all for extremely thoughtful and thought-provoking, varied perspective reflections on the SDGs and on human rights and human security in general as they apply to development. I think that gives us a lot to work with for questions and answers. I will open this up to the floor now because we are a little behind. We'll probably run a tad over, but I will try not to go too far over. So I'll try to get as many as I can. I'm going to take this in groups of 3, please. So we'll start with Stephen next, and You three, please start, and I've seen the others. Raise your hands again next time, please. Go ahead.
Stephen Brown, Ralph Bunche Institute, Future UN Project. I'm afraid I'm siding with the pessimists that we've heard from recently, but I think there's one optimistic aspect of what Jan Wouters has said, which is that precedent could have helped, and perhaps still will help, the process by which we get to the SDGs. I characterize the process so far by referring to the fact that I think we're barking up the wrong tree. And the tree that we're barking up, mistakenly, are the three sectors which are simply based on economic and social, which was enshrined by the Charter in 1945, and to which the tree huggers have now added environmental. And I think that the sectoral approach, which is being taken by the SDGs, is ignoring the precedent which was set in 1990, which was the formulation of the most original and most UN-oriented paradigm of all, which was human development. So if the wrong three are the sectors, the right three, and this refers to the first two presentations, in my view, around human development, begin with human. That's human security, human rights, and human needs. And that way, I think we could come to a more, if there were such a conception, I think we would come to a more optimistic answer to the question that's being asked in this title. So my question is really to ask whichever member of the panel would like to reflect on the idea that we might have done a lot better in terms of justice and equity if the UN Secretariat, which has been practically completely impotent and silent in this process, could have brought back in to the dialogue the concept of human development.
Thank you.
Anthony Bunyan, University of London. I just have two remarks. One around accountability, and it's a question to the panel on accountability. But the other, I know a number of years ago there were a lot of initiatives around measuring and monitoring a range of different sustainable development indicators, measuring progress of societies, groups like the OECD, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, were looking at various different things. A lot of academics around the world have explored well-being, sustainable development indicators. So my question around that is, does anyone on the panel care to venture a way forward in terms of this accountability conundrum with political will being maybe very weak in terms of accountability, including the developed nations as well as developing nations?
Thank you.
Thanks. Hugh Breaking Institute, Ethics, Governance and Law, University of Australia. And so the question is to Professor Gasper. Thank you for the illuminating discussion of human rights and human security. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. You made a persuasive case, I think, that the relationship between the two was complementary. If we view human rights in a specifically legal way, and I was wondering, that's not the only way we can think of human rights. We look at the human rights as we find them articulated in the Universal Declaration. They look much more like a sort of moral perspective. They're talking about the types of human interests that warrant protection, the standard threats that we find to them, and the ways that ordinary human beings, as well as states, can respond to them. And I was thinking, if we're thinking about human rights in that sense, not as an international legal regime, but as a moral perspective, directing our attention to ways in which we might respond to threats to perennial human interests, would the answer change? Would it be then something more like human security is one way of talking about human rights in that moral sense, or would there be a different answer? So that was the query. Thank you.
Okay, I will start by passing the microphone to Des, since you were directly addressed, and then we'll just pass it down the line for everybody's brief commentary on whatever moves you.
Rhoda Howard-Hassman's paper was explicitly formulated in terms of international human rights law. international human rights regime is the term she constantly refers to, and it's the strengths of the legal regime which she wants to hold on to and ensure are not diluted. Now, yeah, human rights is more than than simply a set of legal conventions, and in all of these areas we're partly struggling with language and how we can adequately describe the many levels, the many layers, the many variants, and language also traps us often, that we put things as nouns and they become essentialized and so on. So, yeah, human rights is more. Even so, I don't think human rights it's compatible with various explanatory frameworks, ontological perspectives, etc. Maybe more compatible with some than with others, etc. But it is not in itself, I would say, a particular or evolved explanatory, analytical, ontological perspective. And I suggest that the human security work has helped. It has brought in extra tools which are necessary to complement human rights analysis. I simply am in sympathy with Stephen Brown's remarks. The economic, social, environmental framing is coming out of business, I would say. It's the triple bottom line, etc. type perspective which has come out of business discourse and which has been projected into global governance.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm also very much in sympathy with Stephen's point. I'd say the UN Secretariat did try at several points to intervene, notably after the first iteration of the goals and targets. There was a very strong sense in the Secretariat and amongst the key agencies that this was an unimplementable, if well-intentioned, mess. And so Amina Mohammed, a very impressive Nigerian woman who has been Ban Ki-moon's advisor on SDGs, was asked to perhaps see if it was possible to reorganize all of this into something that would be more easily communicable to the wider public. And she did, with others, produce for the SG a so-called synthesis report, which reorganized the material under 6 headings. Again, comprehensively ignored by the member states. Now, I come back to why are the member states comprehensively ignoring inputs from various sources. I think it goes back to something Jan alluded to, I think, in passing, which was how the Millennium Development Goals were formulated. It's widely recalled, but I wrongly recalled it, that the Millennium Development Goals were adopted at the Millennium Summit. They weren't. About a year later, Kofi Annan's office tabled the goals, targets, and indicators that went with them on the basis of documents from the World Conferences of the 1990s, but organized in their way, and member states grumpily, in the absence of any better ideas, adopted the paragraph adopted the text in, I think it was January 2002, so actually a long time after I had supposed, saying that it might be a hopeful framework. And then they really only took off after the Gleneagles G7 summit and so on some years later. And the member states have been furious ever since that the Secretary General arrogated to himself the right, in the absence of anything useful from them, to formulate a package of goals and so on. And so their objective as a group, a disgruntled group, was absolutely to control this process from start to finish. I'd say that's the overriding characteristic of moving from Rio Plus 20 to where we are today, this sense amongst the member states that it's the member states who matter. And of course it is the member states who matter because ultimately they make the decisions. But this inability to view outside contributions as helpful, I think, is unfortunate. But it's just a personal theory. On accountability, very interesting point, because of course ultimately, if you think of the member states again, how do they consider themselves accountable? Say if you're the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, a politician I follow, quite a kinetic politician, he considers himself accountable to the Indian voters because he hopes to be re-elected. So the accountability mechanism at the level of the politicians in the countries of the world, as opposed to those who negotiate these documents, is rather different. Now, it may also be hopeful, because my positive hope, because like Jan, I do have a positive sense about some of this, is that countries will adopt some of the targets. Will say, well, for us, these 3 or 4 things are what matters, and we're going to work on these 3 or 4 very hard. And then that sets up the leader to be a target herself or himself in domestic politics on this, in terms of accountability. My fear is that leaders won't do any of that they will adopt the package in September and never mention it again, which is what often happens to summit declarations. So I do view it from the perspective of most member states as a menu of options, many of them helpful, and I hope that's the way that governments will approach it positively. You have a microphone, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just address briefly the point about accountability. So I think it would be helpful here to have different kinds of goals, more concrete, more institutional goals. And so a few examples would be if you should abolish beneficial ownership. I mean, you should abolish accounts where the beneficial owner isn't known, right, internationally. Then you would know which country is continuing to allow these secret accounts. You should have every country approach a glide path with regard to greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this would be given through a general formula, and you could then observe which countries are complying with the glide path and which ones are not. You might, with regard to inequalities, say that every country should halve its logarithmic distance from a Palmer ratio of 1. Right? Palmer ratio is the ratio top 10% versus the bottom 40%, and Palmer ratios now range from roughly 1 in the most equal countries to roughly 7 in South Africa. And you might say that, you know, the logarithmic distance is basically the square root. So we should, by 2030, every country should get to the square root of the Palmer ratio that it's now at, unless it's already at 1 or below. We should discontinue the practice of holding countries responsible for loans taken out by rulers who ruled them without any kind of democratic legitimacy, right? If you want to lend money to such rulers, you can, but you're on your own. You can't get the money back from the oppressed populations. So things of that sort, these would be a little bit more concrete, and there it would be very clear whether a particular country is in compliance or not in compliance with the goal.
Yeah, just a brief thought with regard to accountability. It's of course very true. I mean, there is simply there's no elaboration on that. But it reminds me of what Pascal Lamy once said about governance. You know, he said if you look at the various levels of governance, it's really like the state of water. You have at the national level, you have quite solid, icy kind of state of water. At the more regional, say for us, European level, we have the more kind of fluid type of state of water. And at the international level, Lamy said it's gaseous. So, I mean, so you cannot have all these things in that document universally agreed upon. But nothing prevents us, and that's why I'm making that analogy with Lamy's statement, nothing prevents us from deepening and operationalizing things at regional and national levels, and indeed providing for effective accountability mechanisms. There's the other thing, but I'm not going to elaborate on it, is the question of whether we should always continue to think in state-like terms. There's been a big criticism from human rights advocates to the SDGs because there's no single reference to the duties of multinational corporations. And that's opening another can of worms, of course, because the whole question of accountability for certain serious developmental-human rights problems is, of course, not in the hands of states nowadays.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. We'll take this one and this one back here. And I'm so sorry. I know a lot of you want to ask questions. Hopefully grab them afterwards. Please state your questions extremely concisely, and our esteemed panel will try to do the same in response.
Okay, I'm Sylvia Castle-Finkhausen from Wageningen University of Netherlands. You alluded a little bit to this in the discussion accountability, but your criticism was a lot on the content. But how do you look at the SDGs as a policy instrument of global governance, this tendency to develop specific goals with indicators and the whole, think about them if they were the ideal content with integrative indicators. Would that still, is that a good way of doing global governance?
Foundation for Global Governance Sustainability. 2 points. One, the MDGs, we should forget MDG 8, which was about the global partnership for development, and that has not been implemented by developed countries, with big things in terms of trade and other conditions under which developing countries could fulfill those goals. So, I mean, we have to take that into account too, and see how it works for the SDGs. And the second one is, I don't think we should see as competing human security and sustainable development. They may be developed from different groups, even within the UN. Could be the second commitment, the development group that comes to sustainable development. It could be the human rights security group that comes to human security. What is good about them is that they are both multi-level, multifaceted concepts that basically include the same things if we want to see them, like the social aspect of sustainable development includes human rights, includes many other things. So I think instead of competing, we should see how we implement what things that can be implemented by bringing together all ministries and committees, etc., to see things from a different perspective.
Okay, we'll do the same thing in reverse. Please feel free to respond to specific points that you feel.
We could have a whole long discussion about governing through indicators and so on. I want to be very brief about it. I'm skeptical about this approach. I just don't think all of these things can be quantified. And if there is, talk about meddling and politicizing things, indicators, as we have seen today. Look at what the G77 said about the targets and the indicators. It's completely politicized already before we have agreed upon them.
Yeah, on the same point. So I think in principle, this idea of schematizing something, on starting at a high level of generality and saying broadly what should be done and then specifying it and so on, that's quite useful, and to try to specify means of implementation and so on. What's missing is the first link, namely who is the addressee, right? So in philosophy, you might make a distinction between a goal and a wish. And these are the Millennium Development Wishes and the Sustainable Development Wishes. It is something we all agree. Sure, the weather should be good in 2030. The sun should shine. Yeah, easy to agree. But if you don't have a specification of who is responsible to contribute what, if you don't have a division of labor specified, all the subsequent steps are really for nothing, right? So you would have to start with a general thing. Every country should be, let's say, below 2.5 tons greenhouse gas emissions per capita. by 2030. And then the next thing is, okay, so how are the various countries going to get there, and so on and so forth. But without the first link, pointless.
Thank you very much. Challenging questions. I think on global governance, perhaps the Paris Summit will give us a better indication of whether we're prepared for any serious form of global governance, because their governments are committing themselves, although with the caveats you rightly made, to propositions that are more specific. I think of this package as aspirational in both positive and negative ways. It's a catalog rather than a program. And it has the advantages of a catalog. You leaf through it, you find a few things you like. But I would have personally preferred a program. The Global Partnership for Development, actually the whole issue of partnership has also become intensely politicized at the UN. Many delegations at the UN regard the notion as a plot against sovereign governments. If there are partners, what does this say about absolute sovereignty? And you go downhill from there, and other delegations overreact, and next thing you know, you have a full-blown, completely meaningless argument about partnership, sovereignty, and all the rest, whereas you started talking about, rather hopefully, about perhaps development.
SDGs have clearly not become a management system for global development, and I wonder if there's any analogy, though, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a long, aspirational document, but of course it was conceived in that fashion, and the SDGs list is not conceived to be such. Whether it can be used as such, I don't know, but that's maybe. And then the Universal Declaration, of course, then there's a long time perspective for seeing is there influence, how does it percolate, sometimes in surprising ways. I'm fully sympathetic to the second remark. Yes, these are compatible languages fitted to different arenas and functions and so on, which should work together, but the reality is that to some degree there's mutual suspicion, there is mutual scratching, and it does need some attention to try and smooth out relations.
Okay, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel and the conversation they've stimulated. I think this is really wonderful and a really fitting just end to our fabulous conference. I would like to pass the mic now to thank all of you actually first as well, and then pass the mic to Abi, who will conclude with our closing remarks. Should we
Good. Well, good afternoon, friends. And first, I must thank all of you who are here for your staying power. And I hope you've been invigorated by the 2 days of dialogue and debate. And it falls to me